By way of introduction, I thought it would be a good idea just to start maybe with where we are at the moment. David Cameron pledged earlier this year that should the Conservative Party win the next election in 2015, they would seek to renegotiate the terms of Britain's membership of the EU with the specific aim of repatriating powers currently held by Brussels back to the Westminster Parliament. The debate with the EU would be time-limited and the results of their discussions would be put to a referendum of the British people by the end of 2017. Labour, for the moment, is holding out against the idea of this referendum, though there is speculation that might change. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to make some introductory remarks. Then I will kind of ask a few questions, and then we will open the floor up to all of you. Vince Cable has been Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills since 2010, Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham since 1997, former Chief Economist at Shell, and as Business Secretary believes that a pragmatic, positive engagement with the EU is what the business community wants and the country needs, and particularly concerned about the efforts to attract inward investment would be damaged were Britain to leave the EU. Giza Stuart, Labour MP for Birmingham Edgbaston since 1997, was a key member of the drafting body of the European Constitution, which led to the Lisbon Treaty. She believes, though, that current government structure of the EU is unsustainable, lacking democratic accountability combined with bureaucratic sclerosis. Sir Martin Sorrell, founder of WPP, the biggest advertising and marketing communication service currently. That's okay, because of the kind of proposed Omnicom and yeah, okay, we won't go there. So thank you for the heckle. Always welcome. As you see, Sir Martin is quite shy and doesn't like to give his opinions. Luke Johnson is one of this country's leading, I guess, serial entrepreneurs. Pizza Express, The Ivy, Patisserie Valerie, Giraffe, Feng Sushi, Gale's Artisan Bakery. The list goes on. You eat there, he's owned it. Although through Risk Capital Partners, his interests aren't just confined to food and leisure. He's also been chairman of Channel 4, regular columnist for the FT, and is a supporter of Business for Britain. Jessie Norman, in an era of sycophantic MPs whose desire for promotion and preferment is so great that they will do anything to climb the greasy pole on their way to ministerial office, is not one of those people. Bright, articulate, wonderfully free-minded, he perhaps can be a slight irritant to Mr Cameron over Lord's reform, where he led the charge against the government measure which David Cameron pragmatically wanted passed, but such was his skill, he was eventually brought into Number 10 to be part of a policy board, only to abstain a couple of weeks back on the issue of Syria, and to find himself forcibly resigned? I think that's the phrase, or sacked. Vicky Pryce is a Greek-born economist who has also worked in Vincent Cable's department when it was the DTI. She's had a stellar academic career, equally successful time in government where she became head of the government's economic service and has become since then one of the leading commentators on the Eurozone crisis and the threats to it. First of all, Vince Cable.
My approach to this is that I support British continued membership of the European Union, and particularly within the single market. I think it should be reformed internally and externally, but I believe that membership is crucial for the economy, for jobs, and specifically here for the city. My approach to it is a pragmatic one. I'm not a believer in political union in Europe. I don't have any particular sense of European identity. If I was asked to identify with any country outside Britain, it would probably be India. So I'm not approaching this from an ideological standpoint. I simply believe on pragmatic grounds that it's something we should be doing. Because I'm pragmatic, I pose the question, what is the alternative? I was involved in the debates in the 70s around British original membership. I was a young politician in Scotland, and I was struck by the people who were anti, some of them on one side saying this is a wicked capitalist club we shouldn't join, and people on the other side saying it isn't enough of a capitalist club. The world has moved on since then, but we have a whole array of alternatives. Some people say we should be more like Norway in the single market than not the Union. Some say we should be more like Switzerland with a network of treaties but not membership of either. Some people want us to get out altogether. Some people argue for an internationalist free trading alternative, others argue from a nationalistic alternative, stopping the single market, stopping the freedom of movement of labour. We need to be absolutely clear what the counterfactual is. What is the alternative that is being put forward as a single proposition? But let me just make the positive case. In terms of the single market, one of the central issues here is the importance of inward investment in the UK. We're the third largest recipient of inward investment in the world. Much of it comes here on the very clear premise that those companies have access to the European single market. One of our big success stories is the British car industry. We've got 750,000 people directly employed or in the supply chain. Most of those are foreign-owned companies that invest here because there is no tariff between ourselves and the European Union, and because there is a single market and they rely on selling into. And some of them have made it abundantly clear, and indeed the Japanese government made it abundantly clear, that they would reconsider their position if we were not part of it. It applies also to the city. There is a survey that you will no doubt hear more of. I think 60% of the decision makers in the city have said that they are here because they know they have access to the single market and a role in formulating the rules on financial services. And they would not be here otherwise. And we know, on the other hand, in Switzerland, which doesn't have access to the rules of the single market, there is now an exodus taking place here as a consequence of that lack of clarity. In terms of our relationship with the rest of the world, a key point that we have to factor into our long-term view is that much of the growth is happening outside of the European Union. China, India, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, the rest of them. We have to engage with that. I think the critics of the European Union have to explain how we would do better in addressing those opportunities outside rather than inside. Why would the Chinese, the Indians and the rest of them want to give preference, whether it's in terms of negotiating a trade agreement or in particular contractual issues, to a country which is 1/10 the size of the European Union? Why is it that we underperform in those markets? If we wanted to look at role models, we'd be looking at countries like Germany. Far outseen our performance in those emerging markets, and they do it from within the European Union. Nobody has ever explained to me how exiting makes it easier to trade and invest in those economies. Now, there are costs associated with membership. Of course there are. There are regulatory costs. I deal a great deal with small, medium-sized companies who are concerned about regulation, though actually it's probably not the most important of their concerns. But let's ask the question about regulation. Do we need to leave the European Union single market in order to deal with the concerns of SMEs? Many of their biggest concerns, the regulatory burdens on British business, are about things we impose here. They've got nothing to do with the European Union. Things to do with the complexity of the tax system, the visa regime, maybe even the minimum wage regulation. Nothing to do with the European Union. People complain that we gold plate. In other words, the British are even more committed to regulation than the rest of the Union. And how would we avoid many of these regulations? By leaving? You know, the Norwegians have already accepted in full the regulatory framework of the single market, but have no say in it. So what other options do we have? And of course, we can improve things. I frequently chair meetings within the European Union involving fellow European ministers who want to reform it. 18, 20 countries want to liberalise the system, want to simplify regulation, get rid of it, exempt micro companies from complex regulations. One final point, thank you, John. One final point. Uncertainty. There is massive uncertainty in the business environment. Out of the crisis, problems around Scotland. Do we want to make that problem of uncertainty worse by reopening one of the most fundamental aspects of our trade and investment relationship? I think the answer is no. Thank you.
For starters, we've been asked to say, what will happen to the city if the UK leaves the EU? Can I suggest that simply no one in this room has any idea what the answer to that question is? Because what would be the conditions which would leave the British public to vote to leave the European Union, may I suggest that will require a number of conditions. And it would be A, that the UK economy is roaring ahead and doing well. B, that the Eurozone economies are doing really badly. And only under those conditions, and this is a second very important point, would the British openly say that they renounce a supranational organisation and find that the nation-state serves their interests better. Now, in 2017, if there's a Conservative government, which for many reasons I hope there isn't, because I'd prefer a Labour government, but if there is one, that's a referendum which will be put to the people. And the reason why I think that's enormously important was almost exemplified by the very kind opening remarks by the Lord Mayor, who said, people invest here because of our proximity to the European Union. I've got really bad news for you. We are not proximate to the European Union. We are 12.5% of the population of the European Union. We are the European Union. So can we just accept that? And that takes me to three principles which I think we need to look at very, very carefully. And I open this by saying I don't suffer from any of the genetic disadvantages which most of you suffer from, and the debate comes from and has the word Europe in it. I was not born here, so I'm not a little islander. I was actually born in West Germany, as it was. I grew up with a federal state. I'm not afraid of the word F, provided it works. But I actually want a democracy. So I would like to take you to think about three basic principles. A, politicians cannot buck the dynamics of economic realities. So whether Monti, Draghi or anybody else says there's a recovery in the Eurozone and the Euro is going to work, I want to see whether it works. And my view is, I can hear the ice cracking. It's only the United Kingdom and Denmark who have got an opt-out. Everybody is or is under treaty obligations to join the Euro. I don't think the current structure will work, and the fallout will be enormously painful. The second thing is, politicians should not pretend that the electorate is stupid. The electorate may be incredibly inarticulate, but in the back of their mind, they will tell us what the right thing to do is. That's why I think the referendum is an important step, because democratic accountability is very important. And the third one is, and you will hear a lot of this from businessmen, is that bureaucratic efficiency is incredibly important for economic decisions. Well, on that basis, we could have a very passionate debate here, saying that the 2015 general election is really a distraction from getting us back into recovery, because business would much rather prefer to know who's the government, why are we exposing ourselves to this uncertainty. So what I'd like you to ask, and I finish on that note, is the choices between either national accountability or we buy into a supranational accountability. If that's what we do, then we really have to change the way we elect our governments, because our government is no longer in London, it is somewhere else, and we need to face up to that. And the second thing is, if the government under Cameron wishes us to remain within the European Union, it is not a question of review of competences, that is kind of a tinkering. It is a real re-looking at how decisions are made, and for the City of London, the real thing you should be engaging in is qualified majority voting at the moment, which is the majority way in which you make decisions, is on a population base. You need to go back and say that some countries, when they've got a disproportionate interest in certain sectors of the industry, they actually ought to have different weights of voting. And that, if the British people decide that we stay within the European Union, will ensure that things like the city will survive. Because at the moment, we've got a structure which was designed for 3 small and 3 large. Now we are 5 large and 22 small, 23 small and growing, and every which way it will not serve us. And as long as we're outside the EU, the euro and the single currency, our relationship will change, even if we do nothing. That's why I think we need to start thinking about this by far more carefully than we do at the moment.
So we're in the data business, so I thought what we should do is come up with a bit of data, not contrived, but big data. So we sampled TNS, one of our research companies, sampled public opinion from the UK, and the question we asked was, if a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU were to be held tomorrow, would you vote for the UK to stay in or to leave the EU? 39% of the sample voted yes, 43% no, and 18% said they would not vote. So that gives you an idea of what is happening in the electorate at the moment if the referendum took place today. And it's too close to call which way the referendum would go. And what was interesting is that in that poll, we asked people for their priorities for improving public life in the UK and rating three priorities in particular. The top two were generating economic growth and reducing unemployment. Renegotiating our position in the EU was 10th. It was very low down the priority list. So the priority, as far as the electorate is concerned, is economic growth and reducing unemployment. And it's quite interesting that, that the EU membership is so low down people's priorities. And public opinion is starting to move, I think, decisively in favour of EU membership, the more the economic case is made to the electorate. And to sum up the case, I just wanted to simply try and sum it up. The business case for membership rests on, firstly, foreign direct investment. If we were out, FDI would fall sharply. Free trade agreements would have to be renegotiated, would probably take a 10-year period so to do. Our global influence as a nation would decline. Exports would suffer. As far as the city is concerned, the summary is that investment would drop sharply, city firms would relocate to retain single market access, millions of jobs would be at risk, tariffs would occur on half our exports, and red tape would not disappear overnight. So let me just briefly try and go through in my 3 minutes, or a parliamentary 3 minutes, which is much longer. Let me just go through that case. Britain's the world's third largest recipient of FDI after China and the USA. Investors choose to build factories, whether you agree with the previous speaker or not, and locate their businesses here because of our access, not proximity, access to the single market. And research from the City UK shows that 60% of decision makers specifically cited access to the EU markets as a core reason for choosing the UK. So that's FDI. On free trade agreements, as an EU member, we have free trade agreements in existence with over 37 countries, including Mexico and South Korea, which will all have to be renegotiated from scratch if we left. If we had to renegotiate, we would be alone without the bargaining power of a 28-member, 500 million consumer bloc behind us. Third point, global influence. The strong relationships we have around the world are as a result of our position in Europe. When situations like Syria, the Syrian vote happen, we realise how quickly we can feel lonely and indeed isolated. Our global partners have become increasingly vocal about how valuable it is for Britain to remain in the EU. On exports, it is not our EU membership, as Vince Cable has pointed out, which prevents us from exporting more to emerging economies. Why would we cut off our biggest trading partner where half of our exports go currently? Doing this would not make it easier to trade with emerging economies. Looking at the German example, in 2012, just 0.8% of Britain's exports of goods went to China. For Germany, it was 3.4%, over 4 times what we achieved. This is not because we are EU members, it is because we don't make the kinds of goods they want to buy, or not the way that others do. We also don't have the engagement across emerging economies. We don't have a trade presence in China, such as the Germans do. They make huge efforts to engage diplomatically and put investment into making links to these regions. Germany is overtaking the UK as a top European choice for new investment, and Germany is the most successful European exporter, particularly to China and other new markets, and a magnet for international investment. All this is being done as a core member of the Euro and under the same EU rules as Britain, so it can't be EU membership that is holding us back. Let me just turn to the impact on the city and economy if we left. According to the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, the UK would lose a third of FDI over 10 years. Secondly, city firms would relocate, taking jobs and taxes, major revenue source, with them. Only last week, the head of a major investment bank said in very short order they would leave London if voted to exit the European Union. In that case, he described it as a big tail risk to their business. Around 6,000 of its 7,000 strong European workforce, which is in London, might relocate. Financial services account for over 10% of the UK's tax take, half of which comes from international firms headquartered here in London. Losing that would be hugely damaging to our economy. The legal sector, which the first speaker talked about in the UK, accounts for around 7% of the global market for legal services, making it the largest market in Europe. Moreover, half of the revenue of the largest 100 law firms in the UK is generated by international law firms based in London. Okay, millions of jobs will be put at risk. 3 million of the UK's 30 million jobs are linked directly or indirectly to EU exports. We would face tariffs on half our exports, for example, 55% on dairy products, 22% on vans and commercial vehicles, and 10% on cars, making our exports far less competitive. I won't go into further detail on the myth about red tape, but in summary, the EU is the world's largest trading bloc. It's worth £10 trillion out of a total of about 50, home to 500 million consumers and destinations of half our exports. Its completion, that's completion of the market, will be worth up to a further 110 billion to the British economy. Our membership is worth between 31 billion and 92 billion pounds in income gains every year, or per household, 1,200 to 3,500 pounds per household.
The city is perhaps Britain's greatest business asset. It's the world's leading financial centre, providing over 600,000 jobs and 10% of all tax receipts. Generates a trade surplus of £50 billion a year and is by far the greatest contributor to London's economy. That position isn't new. Square Mile's been a world-class trading and merchant hub for centuries, long before the EU was just a twinkle in a French bureaucrat's eye. It's succeeded and grown thanks to a depth of talent, rule of law, title to property, free markets, entrepreneurship, and sensible regulation. For generations, the city has attracted capital and brains from all over the world that want to do business here, insure ships, manage assets, lend money, trade, currencies and commodities, and so forth. Unfortunately, the city's huge success is a source of great unhappiness in Brussels and Strasbourg. It is far too profitable and dynamic for the civil servants and politicians of the EU. That is why they have championed such heavy regulation, which is attacking the very prosperity the city depends upon. For example, the so-called Tobin tax will cost London at least £4 billion and almost certainly drive business elsewhere, costing jobs and eliminating exports. Almost invariably, EU regulation towards the financial sector tends to be disproportionate and heavy-handed, partly because places like Paris, Milan and Berlin suffer so much less than London when it's introduced. While the EU nations matter to the city, they are by no means everything. Of almost 1,000 foreign-owned firms in the city, only 170 are owned by EU members. Our largest single national partner is the US. Emerging markets are by far the fastest growing component of city business. Moreover, the lack of competitiveness across Europe means this trend is almost certain to continue remorselessly, particularly given Europe's demographics. Britain will probably be the fastest growing economy within the EU next year. The EU is a backwards looking organisation that has lost its original purpose, that of a trading federation. Instead, it has become an unaccountable political construct, a profoundly undemocratic and increasingly unpopular burden on the hard-working people of Europe. Too often it is run for the benefit of a political elite of privileged commissioners and others. Ideally, Britain would remain, but in a substantially reformed EU. But politicians have been calling for change for decades and little improves, and much gets worse. We need the power to opt out of laws that damage our industries, like financial services in the city, and an end to ever closer union. But I fear the EU is on a collision course with Britain, and indeed many other member states. It seems likely that there will be a referendum on our continued membership, and quite possibly the public will vote that we leave. And if that happens, I'm confident the city will continue to prosper. It's too powerful and important for EU nations to walk away. Be it banking, insurance, asset management, legal services, MA or shipping. Customers will come here. There was terrible pessimism that staying out of the euro would be a disaster for Europe. Instead, it is now utterly clear that joining it would have been a catastrophe for us. For example, Sir Martin Sorrell and others in 2003 wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph saying that ruling out membership of the euro would be damaging for British-based businesses, British employees and the British economy as a whole. Commercial reality strongly dictates that the risks of staying outside the euro far outweigh the risks of joining. How wrong they were. Instead, if we were to leave the EU, we would thrive, just as Switzerland and Norway do. Highest GDP per capita in Europe. We could dispense with many of the 120,000 directives and regulations the EU impose on us. We could save much of the £120 billion a year the Taxpayers' Alliance estimates the EU costs us, thanks to nonsense like the Common Agricultural Policy and our inability to control our own legislation. We should be confident in our ability as an independent nation to prosper if we are free to control our own destiny, rather than remaining shackled to a job destruction machine whose masters don't really believe in capitalism. Thank you.
Of course, we just heard how important the city is for the UK. And of course, it's useful to just think back at the beginning of the crisis and what's been happening since. The UK was hit very, very substantially because the financial sector is so big. And of course, the whole crisis was a financial-induced crisis. We became the bad man of Europe, if you like. And yet, here we are a few years later, having survived, with a bit of help, of course, from the government. But overall, the city has managed to retain its reputation after the knocks that it got at the beginning of the whole process. And it is indeed, as we've been hearing, still the city that attracts the vast majority of foreign financial institutions which want to deal from here, for Europe, but also internationally. And of course, they do employ lots of people, and they create a lot of foreign exchange for us. So it's useful to think about what's happened, therefore, if we are to answer the question of why would the city, or why would any argument, touch the city and say we'd be better off if we were out. Slightly different to what we've heard so far. Is it competition? I just said that we've actually done rather well over the last few years, and here we are, very, very competitive in relation to the rest of Europe. If you look at what's going on elsewhere, a number of the banks in Europe are basket cases. There's been some sort of cover-up of it that has been going on for quite some time. Look at Spain and what's been going on there. Look at Italy, look at France. All the banks have had very, very serious difficulties indeed. And you could actually argue that because of the sovereign risk factor that's been out there, the banks, of course, are full of sovereign bonds in Europe. The risk hasn't gone away, and we haven't resolved the banking crisis in Europe. So it's not competition. We're actually doing rather well right now, and I think we'll continue to do so. So what's the other reason we may want to leave? Regulation. We've heard a little bit about this. But in fact, we have tighter regulation than most countries in Europe. As you know, we've had the John Vickers report. John Vickers himself, today only, in the Financial Times, was reported as saying that capital requirements need to be even higher. We have actually instituted a regime where capital requirements are higher than the rest of Europe and where, in fact, regulatory oversight is considerably greater than is the case elsewhere. And the others are just catching up with us, really. So we're not influenced by what is going on out there. We're actually managing it ourselves. We take the rules and we interpret them the way we want them, or we start them ourselves, and then others follow. So it wouldn't be because of regulation. That hasn't actually added lots of extra costs to the financial sector. Would it be because we fear that perhaps the centre of Europe will move? But I don't really think so. I did a study for the city a little while ago, which looked at where things might go if regulation perhaps or something else happened, such as perhaps us leaving the EU. It wouldn't go to Frankfurt or Paris. A lot of things would just move across the Atlantic to New York. And therefore, we are, in fact, very, very important for Europe, and they want us there, and they want us to prosper. But we are worried, nevertheless, about the changes that are taking place right now in relation to having a greater oversight in Europe over what's going on in their defunct, in a number of areas, banking sector. In other words, the move towards a banking union. We fear it. We think that perhaps that would mean that the centre will move and that the European Central Bank, which is now the single supervisory authority, is going to gain so much power, and the little group that's going to be running what goes on in the Eurozone is going to exclude us, and we're therefore not going to have any influence over this. I just explained how competitive we have remained despite everything that's happened, and how competitive we remain despite not joining the euro. And I think we will continue to remain competitive. But what we do want is, in fact, a stronger Europe right now. Everything that we do here, all the arguments you heard so far, have to do with our dealings with Europe. A strong Europe is good for us, for trade, for financial transactions, and for everything that we do, including professionals working across various countries, and of course for the banks here to be able to recruit anyone that they want. What we need to be doing, instead of worrying, is actually pushing for greater speed in terms of a banking union in Europe. Because what we need is to ensure that the banks that shouldn't be making any loans or even surviving should be able to be wound down in a single, simple way, and that there is guarantee across for all the depositors in Europe, so they don't fear that there is going to be a run on banks at any time should there be any issue at all in the country. We want a Europe that lends, a Europe where businesses are able to develop and employ people, and as a result buy from us. So we shouldn't worry in the slightest about this move towards greater cooperation across countries in the Eurozone on the banking side. It should all be to our benefit. So I conclude by saying there's nothing for us to fear. We should not be even contemplating the possibility of leaving Europe, because in fact we have nothing to fear from integration in Europe, quite the opposite. And we should be in there influencing it. If we leave, we won't be able to do that. Thank you.
The question before us is not whether or not the UK should leave the EU. It is simply, will the city prosper if it does, in fact, do so? I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is almost certainly yes. The city will prosper, but with one important caveat, and I'll come to that first. The caveat is that the UK's exit, if such it be after 2017, be an orderly one. That is to say that it follow a procedure where in uncharted territory, but broadly speaking the procedure laid down in section 50 of the Treaty of Rome. But there is a serious risk that such a departure would not be orderly, and that there might be specific barriers thrown up to financial services against, as it were, the Anglo-Saxon model, that there might be a pushing up of non-tariff barriers that the single market has struggled so long to overcome, that there might be pressure on the continental banks that have their headquarters in London to relocate for reasons of national pride and access, and indeed that there might be a sense of a feeling of punishment at the UK for destroying what has become known as the European project. So for all those reasons it's possible that a departure of the UK could be prejudicial, and that would make a difference. But let's assume, as I like to assume, that if it happened, it would not be disorderly. The negotiations will go better than is widely expected, and even if they didn't, why shouldn't the city panic? Why shouldn't the city worry about the possibility of leaving the EU? I want to suggest that there are three main reasons. Several of them have been touched on by my predecessors on my side of the argument. Let me just briefly recap them. One is the historic size and domination of the City of London within Europe and indeed within the world, advantages of language, of time, of openness, time zone, of openness and of culture, which will not be eradicated by the pen of any European bureaucrat for yea or for nay. The second, as part of that, let me just remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that the last thing that Germany and France want is for us to leave, because that leaves them at facing each other unmediated by Anglo-Saxon common sense. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that they're desperate for us to stay in and add some free market zest to their natural instincts for protectionism and the state. May I remind you that the East India Company, one of our great trading companies, one of the founding multinationals of the world, was able to succeed because of the failure of its French counterpart, the Compagnie des Indes, in the 18th century. And why did it fail? It failed because the Compagnie des Indes was owned by the monarch. It didn't have shares that were traded. It didn't feed into and feed off an entrepreneurial class, a class of merchants. It was short on capital, and it was short on connections. And it was hardly surprising that the East India Company were able to romp all over it. That was the reason that Burke, my great hero, was called into action to pen them back. We know that the EU doesn't threaten our historic size and our time zone and our culture. It's fair to say, secondly, of course, that the EU constrains as much as it enables us, in fact, possibly more so. Luke Johnson's been very eloquent on this point. The single market's a very partial construction. There are elements of protectionism that are likely to grow with concerns about the need for increasing regulatory interference in the City of London after 2008. And the Eurozone itself is, of course, a huge source of risk for us. I mean, the third reason we shouldn't worry is, of course, the rest of the world is growing like topsy, lest we forget. Especially the Commonwealth. According to the IMF, the Eurozone is going to grow over the next 5 years by something like 2.7% a year. It seems to me extremely optimistic, that number, but that is the official number as of last year. They estimate the Commonwealth will grow by 7.3%. a year over the next 5 years. By 2050, the increase in population of the Commonwealth will be greater than the total population of the Eurozone. That's the third reason. But there's one final and overwhelming reason which I think should put the matter beyond doubt, if I may. It has two parts. The first is that the Lord Mayor himself said recently, I feel the city will thrive whatever happens because it's a pragmatic place, and I think we should all pay attention when we're in the Guildhall to the Lord Mayor. And the second reason is that no less a person than Tony Blair, the sage of Baghdad, opined in the immortal pages of the Evening Standard today in favour, or rather against the motion that we are proposing. And if Tony Blair is against it, I put it to you that no sane person can be anything other than for it. I rest my case. Thank you very much.